I had just finished building my dream home, a masterpiece of modern architecture that stood as a bold contrast to the cookie-cutter houses lining the streets of my new neighborhood. It was a structure of innovation, a house that defied the conventional aesthetics of suburban life with its sharp lines, expansive glass panels, and a unique blend of steel and wood. It was the kind of house that turned heads. Some people admired it. Others, like Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, despised it with every fiber of their being. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp, white envelope placed neatly in my mailbox. The HOA's official letterhead was stamped at the top, and beneath it, the words dripped with passive-aggressive authority. According to them, my home did not maintain the aesthetic harmony of the community. The letter was more of a demand than a request. I was to modify my house to fit within their vision of acceptability or face escalating consequences. I could practically hear Karen's voice in the wording, her displeasure seeping through the page. I tossed the letter aside, fully aware that a confrontation was inevitable. It didn't take long. The very next morning, as I was watering the newly laid grass in my front yard, Karen made her grand entrance. She marched across the street like a general leading an army, her short platinum bob bobbing furiously with every step. A clipboard was clutched in her hands, a permanent scowl etched onto her face. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. Instead, she extended a perfectly manicured hand toward my house, as if it were a contagious disease. "This," she spat, "is unacceptable." I turned off the hose and looked at her with amusement. "Good morning to you too, Karen," she huffed, clearly not in the mood for small talk. "You can't seriously expect to keep this thing in our neighborhood." I glanced at my house and then back at her, feigning confusion. "You mean my house? The one that's on my legally purchased property? The one that passed all city inspections?" Karen's nostrils flared. "It's an eyesore. It ruins the entire look of the community. Everyone agrees." I arched an eyebrow. "Everyone?" She faltered for a moment, then regained her composure. "The HOA has standards. You were given clear guidelines before you moved in." I smirked. "Actually, I was given a brochure with suggestions. Nothing in there is legally binding." Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened. "We have the authority to enforce changes." I crossed my arms, enjoying the way her frustration deepened. "Is that so? And what exactly are you proposing I do? Tear it down and build a replica of your house?" Her lips pursed. "You need to make adjustments. Change the exterior to match the approved color palette. Remove those ridiculous glass walls. And that roof design. It needs to be fixed." I chuckled. "Ah, so you're an architect now?" She bristled. "I don't need to be an architect to know what looks good." I took a slow step forward, dropping my voice just enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "Well, I am an architect." Her eyes narrowed. "So what?" I smiled. "I designed this house myself." She let out a humorless laugh. "Figures. Some amateur project, huh? That explains a lot." I waited a beat before delivering the knockout punch. "I also worked on the last White House renovation." For a moment, Karen's brain seemed to short-circuit. Her eyes flickered between me and my house, as if trying to process the information. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she managed to sputter. "That's impossible." I shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I can assure you I know more about design and structural integrity than anyone in this neighborhood, including you." Karen's face turned a shade of red so intense that I briefly wondered if she might explode. She adjusted her clipboard, struggling to regain her composure. "Regardless," she snapped, "this house does not fit the standards. You have 1 week to comply, or we will escalate the matter." I tilted my head. "Escalate? You mean send more letters? Maybe host an emergency HOA meeting about my ugly house?" Her jaw clenched. "We have ways to enforce compliance." I grinned. "You mean fines? Go ahead. I can afford them." Her face twitched. "The HOA has the power to take legal action." I let out a slow whistle. "You're really willing to take me to court over a house that legally meets all zoning and building codes?" She hesitated, clearly not expecting me to be so well-informed. "The community has spoken," she said weakly, as if that was supposed to mean something. I took a deep breath, pretending to consider her words. Then I leaned in slightly and said, "Karen, let me make this easy for you. You can waste your time fighting a battle you're going to lose, or you can accept the fact that my house isn't going anywhere. Either way, I'm not changing a damn thing." Karen's eyes burned with pure indignation, but she knew she had hit a wall. She spun on her heel and stormed away, muttering something about board meetings and legal counsel. I watched her go, chuckling to myself. This was far from over, but I had the upper hand, and she knew it. As the days passed, the hostility grew. It started with whispers from neighbors who had once been friendly. Then came the dirty looks, the cold shoulders. A few even had the audacity to tell me that I should have just followed the rules to keep the peace. But I had never been one to bow to unreasonable authority, especially not when that authority was a woman who thought she could bully me into submission. The second letter arrived by the end of the week, even more aggressive than the first. This time, it wasn't just a demand for compliance. It was a threat. The HOA was now claiming that my house posed a safety concern and that they had reported me to the city for violations. I laughed as I read it, shaking my head at their desperation. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Later that evening, as I sat on my porch sipping a beer and watching the sunset reflect off my house's sleek glass panels, I noticed movement across the street. Karen stood on her lawn, arms crossed, glaring at me with the intensity of a woman scorned. I raised my bottle in a silent toast. She turned on her heel and stomped inside, slamming her door so hard that I heard it from where I sat. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and immediately noticed something was off. My driveway, which had been pristine the night before, was now covered in streaks of dried egg yolk and splattered shells. I sighed, staring at the mess. This was no random act of vandalism. It was petty, targeted, and unmistakably the work of someone who had taken my refusal as a personal insult. I didn't need to be a detective to figure out exactly who that someone was. I shook my head and walked back inside, deciding that cleaning up the mess could wait until after breakfast. As I sipped my coffee, I scrolled through my email and nearly laughed out loud. There were at least a dozen messages from the HOA, each one escalating in aggression. They had sent a formal cease and desist notice, accusing me of disrupting the visual unity of the neighborhood. Another email contained a list of supposed violations I was committing, including failure to adhere to community aesthetic guidelines and causing distress among residents. Distress over a house. I imagined Karen sitting at her computer, furiously typing out these messages, convinced that if she threw enough legal-sounding words at me, I would crumble. After finishing my coffee, I went outside with a hose and rinsed the mess off my driveway. As I did, I noticed my next-door neighbor, Greg, standing in his yard, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Greg had always been the type to keep his head down and avoid unnecessary conflict, but now he hesitated, as if debating whether or not to acknowledge me. I looked up and gave him a nod. "Morning, Greg." He shifted on his feet before giving me a tight smile. "Morning." There was a pause, and then he cleared his throat. "Listen, I just wanted to say, I don't have anything against your house personally, but a lot of people around here, they are pretty upset." I arched an eyebrow. "Upset about what exactly?" Greg glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching. "Karen's been going around talking to people. She says your house is going to lower property values. She even started a petition." I couldn't help but smirk. "A petition? To do what? Magically make my house disappear?" Greg scratched his head. "I don't know, man. She's saying the HOA has ways to force you to comply." I turned off the hose and crossed my arms. "Let me guess. She came to you with some horror story about how my house is going to destroy the neighborhood." Greg hesitated before nodding. "Something like that." I sighed. "Greg, let me ask you something. Have you ever actually looked into HOA regulations? Do you know what they can and can't enforce?" He blinked. "I mean, not really. I just pay my fees and try to stay out of trouble." "That's exactly what they want," I said. "They rely on people not questioning them. But the reality is, they have no legal grounds to force me to change my house. They can try to fine me, but I can fight those in court. And trust me, I know how to win." Greg looked genuinely surprised, as if the thought of challenging the HOA had never occurred to him. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the morning air. Well. Discussing the neighborhood's biggest problem, I see." I turned to find Karen standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, her ever-present clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Her expression was one of smug satisfaction, as if she had caught me in the middle of some nefarious plot. "Karen," I said dryly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just making my rounds, ensuring the neighborhood remains a pleasant place to live." I gestured toward my now clean driveway. "Did that include orchestrating an egg attack?" Her expression remained carefully neutral. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I smirked. "Right. And I suppose the sudden flood of HOA emails was just a coincidence. She tilted her head. We're simply enforcing community standards. You've made it clear that you have no interest in cooperating. Cooperating? I repeated. You mean giving in to your ridiculous demands? Her smile tightened. The community has spoken. The petition already has over 50 signatures. I gave her a slow clap. 50 whole signatures? Wow, that must be, what, half the neighborhood? I'm sure the city council will be fascinated by this incredibly serious crisis. Her eyes flashed with irritation. This isn't a joke. We're prepared to take further action. I leaned against my car and folded my arms. Let me save you some trouble. You can send as many notices as you want. You can rally as many signatures as you like. But at the end of the day, my house is staying exactly the way it is. Karen's nostrils flared. You're making a mistake. I shrugged. We'll see. With that, she turned on her heel and stomped away. Her clipboard clutched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I watched her retreat with mild amusement before turning back to Greg, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his lawn. See what I mean? I said. Greg let out a slow breath. Yeah, I think I do. For the next few days, the hostility from the neighborhood continued to build. I started receiving anonymous complaint calls to my work phone. The HOA board sent another round of letters, this time vaguely threatening legal action. Even the city inspector showed up at my door, citing an anonymous report that my house was a safety hazard. The inspector, a tired-looking man in his 50s, barely glanced at my house before shaking his head. This is a waste of time, he muttered. Your house is up to code. Whoever reported this is just trying to cause problems. I chuckled. I think we both know who it was. He sighed. Yeah, this kind of thing happens more than you'd think. As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karen was throwing everything she had at me, but nothing was sticking, and that had to be driving her absolutely insane. Then, just when I thought she couldn't get any more desperate, she pulled her boldest move yet. Late one evening, as I was winding down for the night, flashing red and blue lights illuminated my windows. I frowned, stepping outside to find 2 police officers standing at the edge of my property. My stomach twisted as I realized what was happening. Karen had called 911 on my house. I approached the officers, keeping my hands visible. Evening, officers. What seems to be the problem? One of them, a stocky man with a bored expression, glanced at his notepad. We got a call about an unauthorized structure causing distress to the community. I almost laughed. An unauthorized structure? My house. The other officer, a younger guy, looked slightly embarrassed. Yeah, we get these calls sometimes, usually from HOAs trying to strong-arm homeowners. And there she was, standing on her front porch, watching the scene unfold with a victorious smirk. She must have thought she had won. I turned to the officers. You might want to check my credentials before you waste any more of your time. They exchanged a glance before one of them asked, and what credentials would those be? I pulled out my phone and opened an email containing my professional license and my past projects. I designed this house myself. I also happened to work on the last White House renovation. Both officers' expressions shifted. Karen's smirk faltered. This was about to get interesting. The police officers exchanged glances, their initial air of authority now mixed with uncertainty. One of them, the younger of the two, leaned in slightly to get a better look at my phone screen. His eyes widened as he read through the credentials displayed in the email. The other officer, older and with the weary demeanor of someone who had seen just about everything, sighed as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. So let me get this straight, the older officer said, turning his gaze towards Karen, who stood with her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. You called 911 because of a house. Karen huffed indignantly. Not just any house. This monstrosity is bringing down the entire neighborhood. It's violating community standards. It's a safety hazard. It sits. The officer held up a hand to cut her off. Calling emergency services for something like this is a misuse of public resources. We're here to handle real crimes, not disputes over personal taste. Karen's face twisted into an expression of pure outrage. This isn't just a matter of taste. This thing is an eyesore. It's ruining our property values. I folded my arms, watching the scene unfold with mild amusement. The younger officer shook his head, still staring at my credentials. Sir, you really worked on the White House renovation? I nodded. And several other government buildings. My house is built to strict standards, meets all zoning regulations, and is completely legal. The older officer sighed again, shifting his weight as he turned to Karen. Ma'am, you might not like the way his house looks, but that doesn't make it a crime. You can't just call 911 every time someone does something you don't like. Karen's mouth opened and closed as she struggled to come up with a response. Her face had gone from its usual pale complexion to a deep shade of red, and for a moment, I wondered if she might actually start screaming. Instead, she crossed her arms even tighter and snapped. So you're just going to do nothing? You're not even going to write him up for anything? The officer exhaled sharply, clearly reaching the end of his patience. There's nothing to write him up for. His house is legal. It's not a crime to have bad taste, if that's what you think. But what is illegal is filing false emergency reports. So unless you want us to write you up, I suggest you stop wasting our time. Karen's eyes widened with a mix of shock and horror. You're threatening me now? She screeched. I have rights. I pay taxes. The older officer gave her a long, unimpressed look. Yeah, so does everyone else, including him. And right now, you're dangerously close to facing a fine for misusing emergency services. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Karen actually looked rattled. Her bravado wavered, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might back down. But then she squared her shoulders, let out a sharp breath, and turned on her heel. Without another word, she stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her with so much force that I swore the windows rattled. The younger officer let out a low whistle. She's a piece of work. I chuckled. You have no idea. The older officer gave me a small nod. Sorry to bother you with this, sir. Looks like you've got yourself a persistent one there. I shrugged. Yeah, but she's running out of options. The officers exchanged one last glance before heading back to their patrol car. As they pulled away, I turned my attention to Karen's house, half expecting her to be peering out through her blinds. I wasn't disappointed. I could just barely make out the shape of her silhouette lurking behind her front window, watching me like a predator waiting for its next move. I smiled and waved. The blind snapped shut. With a satisfied sigh, I headed back inside. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen had been publicly humiliated, and if there was one thing I had learned about people like her, it was that they didn't take embarrassment well. If anything, I had just poured gasoline on an already raging fire. The next day, the retaliation began. It started small. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked over in the middle of the night. The next morning, a few of my trash bins had been accidentally tipped over, their contents strewn across my driveway. I had a good idea of who was behind it, but I had no proof, and Karen was just smart enough to avoid getting caught red-handed. Then came the official complaints. The HOA sent another notice, this time citing concerns raised by multiple residents regarding the structural integrity of your home. According to the letter, the HOA had reasonable suspicion to believe my house might not meet safety regulations and would be requesting an official inspection. I laughed when I read it. This was their big move, trying to get my house flagged as unsafe. I had designed buildings that could withstand hurricanes. I knew for a fact that my home was one of the safest structures in the entire neighborhood. If anything, the houses around me, built using outdated methods and cheap materials, should be the ones getting inspected. Still, I decided to play along. I called the city inspector myself and arranged for an official inspection. When he arrived, he barely even stepped inside before rolling his eyes and shaking his head. I already know what this is, he muttered. Let me guess, overzealous HOA? Something like that, I said. The inspector did a thorough walkthrough, checked the foundation, reviewed the permits, and took a few photos. At the end of it all, he gave me a firm handshake. Your house is solid, he said. They are just wasting their time. That night, I made sure to send a copy of the official inspection approval to the HOA. I also made sure Karen got a personal copy, just in case she had any doubts. The next morning, I found a new note taped to my door. This time, there were no official letterheads, no HOA stamps, just a single piece of paper with 4 words scrolled across it in thick, angry letters. This isn't over yet. I couldn't help but smile. Karen was getting desperate, and that meant I was winning. As I stood there reading the note, I thought about what Karen's next move could possibly be. She had tried complaints, legal threats, community outrage, and even the police. None of it had worked. So what was left? Then it hit me. She was going to make this personal. I had seen people like Karen before. When they couldn't win with rules and regulations, they resorted to intimidation. But I wasn't the kind of person who could be intimidated, and if Karen thought she was going to bully me into submission, she was about to be very disappointed. I took the note, crumpled it in my hand, and tossed it in the trash. Then I sat back, waiting for Karen's next move. Because whatever she was planning, I was ready. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, half expecting another petty act of vandalism or a new HOA notice taped to my door. But for once, everything was quiet. No overturned trash bins, no mysterious spills on my driveway, no passive-aggressive letters. It felt like the eerie calm before a storm, the kind of silence that told me Karen wasn't giving up. She was just planning something bigger. I wasn't naive. I had seen people like her before, people who couldn't stand the idea of losing. She had tried legal threats, community outrage, even calling the police. None of it had worked. Now she was likely shifting her strategy, looking for ways to force me out through more creative means. I had to be ready. It didn't take long for her next move to reveal itself. That afternoon, while I was working in my home office, a loud knocking echoed through the house. I opened the door to find a group of people standing on my porch. At the front of the pack was an older man in a stiff suit, flanked by two other HOA board members, none of whom had ever bothered to introduce themselves before. And of course, just behind them, standing slightly to the side with a triumphant smirk, was Karen. The man in the suit cleared his throat and extended a hand. "Mr. Carson? I'm Richard Hayes, president of the HOA. We'd like to have a discussion about your property." I shook his hand, but didn't invite them inside. "Is this about the inspection?" "Because I already sent the HOA a copy of the results. My house is fully compliant." Richard forced a polite smile, but I could see the tension in his face. "We're aware, but the board has been reviewing additional concerns raised by members of the community." I glanced at Karen, who was practically radiating smugness. "Let me guess," I said. "Karen, is the community?" Karen let out a huff. "It's not just me. Many of your neighbors have expressed discomfort with the disruptive nature of your home's presence." I crossed my arms. "Disruptive? How is my house disruptive? It just sits here, minding its own business." Richard sighed as if he were dealing with a difficult child. "Mr. Carson, we understand that you have a background in architecture and that you take pride in your work. However, this neighborhood has a particular aesthetic, and your home, well, it stands out in a way that some find upsetting." I resisted the urge to laugh. "So let me get this straight. You're saying my house is causing emotional distress?" Richard's smile faltered. "We're saying that a resolution needs to be found. The board is willing to work with you on a compromise." I leaned against the doorframe. "And what kind of compromise are we talking about?" Karen stepped forward, seizing the opportunity to take control of the conversation. "You need to make alterations, change the exterior, remove those ridiculous glass walls, adjust the color scheme to match the approved palette." I stared at her, unimpressed. "You mean turn my house into a bland, cookie-cutter box like yours?" Her nostrils flared. "It's called uniformity." I shook my head. "Yeah, that's not happening." Richard sighed. "Mr. Carson, we don't want this to escalate into something unpleasant." I smirked. "See, that sounds a lot like a threat." Karen folded her arms. "It's a warning." I exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right, since you all love rules so much, let's talk about them." The HOA's regulations clearly state that exterior changes only require approval if they involve a structural modification that extends beyond property lines or poses a safety risk. My house does neither. There is no clause in your bylaws that dictates aesthetic preference beyond basic upkeep. And since my property is maintained to a higher standard than most houses here, there's no violation. Richard's face twitched. Karen's smirk disappeared. I continued. "Now, if the HOA wants to take legal action, I welcome it. But I should warn you that I have the resources to fight back, and I'd be more than happy to expose any questionable HOA activities during the process." Karen stiffened. "What are you insinuating?" I smiled. "Oh, just the fact that I've noticed a few discrepancies in the HOA's financial records. It would be a shame if an audit revealed any misuse of funds." Her face turned pale. Richard stepped in quickly. "That won't be necessary. Let's not let this situation get out of hand." I shrugged. Then maybe the HOA should focus on actual problems instead of harassing homeowners who follow the rules. There was a tense silence. Richard shifted uncomfortably before nodding. "We'll discuss this further at the next board meeting." I watched as they turned and walked away, Karen's heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She didn't look back, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, I decided it was time for my own petty revenge. I spent hours reviewing the HOA bylaws, looking for the same kind of loopholes they had tried to use against me. And I found one. The HOA's aesthetic restrictions only applied to homes visible from the street. Nowhere did it say anything about additions built behind privacy walls. The next morning, I made a few calls. Within a week, A construction crew arrived and began working on a massive privacy fence surrounding my property. Made from high-end materials and designed to the exact height restrictions, it was a towering, modern masterpiece that completely blocked Karen's view of my house. The best part? It was fully compliant with HOA rules. The day it was completed, I stood in my yard admiring my work. Across the street, Karen was fuming. She stormed over, stopping just short of my property line. "You can't do this," she seethed. I took a sip of my coffee. I checked the bylaws. Turns out I can. Her hands balled into fists. "This is an act of aggression." I grinned. "No, Karen. This is just me following the rules." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. I watched as the realization sank in. She had lost. The fence wasn't just a barrier. It was a statement. She could no longer see my house, could no longer use its appearance as an excuse to harass me. For the first time since this war had started, she had nothing left to fight against. She turned on her heel and stomped away, and I knew, deep down, that she was already scheming her next move. But it didn't matter, because every time she tried to play her game, I would be one step ahead. And eventually, she was going to realize that she had picked a fight she could never win. The fence had changed everything. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I had taken control of the situation. Karen could no longer use my house as a weapon in her personal crusade against modern design. She couldn't see it, couldn't complain about it, couldn't rally the neighborhood into another frenzy over its appearance. But I knew that wasn't the end. Karen was the type of person who thrived on conflict. If she couldn't attack my house directly, she would find another way to come after me. The first attempt came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers were slipped under doors, emails were sent out, and Karen made her rounds personally, knocking on doors and whispering about how my actions were ruining the community. I knew about the meeting before she even had a chance to gloat about it, so I decided to attend. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere was tense. A small crowd had gathered, mostly older residents who had lived in the neighborhood for years and who were used to Karen calling the shots. She stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, her expression smug and victorious as she watched me walk in. Richard, the HOA president, sat beside her, looking more exhausted than usual. Karen wasted no time getting started. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because one homeowner has decided to completely disregard the traditions and values of our community." She shot a glance in my direction, making sure everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. "This individual has ignored repeated requests to conform to our neighborhood's aesthetic. He has built an eyesore, erected an unnecessary barrier, and continuously flaunted his refusal to cooperate with this association." I leaned back in my chair, waiting. She was making a show of it, playing to her audience, but I knew she had no real argument. Still, I let her talk. "Our neighborhood thrives on unity," she continued. "We all follow the same rules. We respect the standards that make this a desirable place to live. But this homeowner has decided that he is above those rules." Richard cleared his throat. "Karen, let's keep this civil. Mr. Carson is here, and we should allow him to speak as well." Karen's smile was tight. "Of course," she said, though it was clear she didn't mean it. I stood up, taking my time as I looked around the room. "I'd like to ask a question," I said. "How many of you have actually read the HOA bylaws?" A few people shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Most of them probably hadn't. "Because I have," I continued. "And nowhere in those bylaws does it say a home has to match a specific design. Nowhere does it say an HOA can force someone to change a legally approved structure. What it does say is that any action taken against a homeowner must be based on actual violations, which, I should remind you, I do not have." A murmur spread through the room. Karen's face hardened. I took a step forward, locking eyes with her. Karen has been using the HOA as her personal tool to bully me into compliance, even though she has no legal standing to do so. She has sent false complaints, wasted city resources by calling in unnecessary inspections, and even called the police over a house she doesn't like. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Karen's expression darkened. "And if we're talking about following rules," I said, reaching into my pocket, "maybe we should take a look at how the HOA itself has been operating." I pulled out a few printed documents and handed them to Richard. I requested a financial audit of HOA spending over the last 2 years. It turns out there are some discrepancies. Richard took the papers, his brow furrowing as he scanned them. The room fell silent. Karen's mouth tightened. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. "Because according to these records, HOA funds have been used for several administrative expenses that don't seem to have any receipts or explanations. And those expenses just happened to coincide with the exact time frame that Karen took over as HOA president. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Richard's face paled. Karen's jaw clenched so tightly that I thought her teeth might crack. "Now," I said, turning back to the room, "I don't know about you, but I think an HOA should be focusing on actual issues, like making sure funds are being used properly, instead of harassing a homeowner over the design of his house." The murmurs turned into full-blown conversations. Some people were nodding, others were whispering to each other. I had planted the seed, and I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Richard cleared his throat. "I think we need to take some time to review these documents before making any decisions." Karen slammed her clipboard onto the table. "This is an outrage. He's lying. This is a distraction from the real issue." I shrugged. "If I'm lying, then you have nothing to worry about, right?" She glared at me, her face red with fury, but the damage was done. The vote to remove Karen as HOA president happened 2 weeks later. It wasn't even close. The moment the financial discrepancies were brought up in an official capacity, people started questioning everything she had done. Homeowners who had once been her allies turned against her. The board, eager to distance themselves from any potential scandal, voted overwhelmingly in favor of replacing her. Karen didn't take it well. The day after the vote, she stormed across the street and stood on the edge of my property, seething. I watched from my porch, waiting for whatever explosion was coming. "This is all your fault," she spat. I sipped my coffee. "You did this to yourself." She jabbed a finger toward my house. "You think you won? You think this is over?" I leaned against the railing. "Karen, you've been fighting a battle you were never going to win. You tried to force me out, and now you're the one leaving." She sucked in a sharp breath, her face twisting with barely contained rage. I could tell she wanted to say more, but she was out of ammunition. She had lost, and there was nothing she could do about it. Without another word, she turned and stomped back to her house. The next week, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The neighborhood was different after that. The new HOA president was far more reasonable, focusing on actual community concerns instead of personal vendettas. People who had once given me dirty looks started warming up, some even admitting that Karen had manipulated them. Over time, the hostility faded. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, my new neighbors, a friendly couple who had just moved into Karen's old house, walked over to introduce themselves. We chatted for a while, and just before they left, I couldn't help but smirk. "If you ever have HOA trouble," I said, "call me." They laughed, not realizing how serious I was. As I watched them walk away, I took a deep breath, enjoying the quiet. No more Karen, no more ridiculous complaints, no more battles to fight. I had one, and my house, the same one she had tried so hard to erase, was still standing exactly as I had designed it. The absence of Karen was noticeable almost immediately. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more passive-aggressive letters, no more ridiculous complaints, no more dirty looks from neighbors afraid to be on the wrong side of an HOA war. It was as if a weight had been lifted off the entire community. Even the people who had once sided with her seemed relieved. A week after the for sale sign went up in her yard, I noticed a moving truck parked in her driveway. From my porch, I watched as she and her husband, who I had seen maybe twice in the entire time I lived here, loaded up their belongings. There was something almost satisfying about watching her pack up, knowing she had lost the battle she started. At one point, she turned and caught me watching. Her glare was sharp, full of unspoken resentment. I simply lifted my coffee mug in a silent toast. She scowled, muttered something under her breath, and turned away. She was probably rehearsing some dramatic exit speech in her head, but I didn't care enough to hear it. She had burned too many bridges to get a proper farewell. By midday, the truck was full, and Karen took one last look at the house she had fought so hard to defend from my so-called invasion. Then, without fanfare, she climbed into the passenger seat, and her husband drove off. Just like that, she was gone. That night, I stood on my balcony, looking over the neighborhood. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the person who had made my life miserable for so long had finally given up. The quiet felt almost surreal. I had gotten so used to the back-and-forth battle that part of me expected her to reappear with some last-minute scheme. But there was no Karen, just the distant hum of crickets and the soft glow of my LED driveway, a feature that had sent her into a fury more times than I could count. Over the next few weeks, The neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's influence, the HOA shifted its focus to actual community concerns, maintaining the park, improving security, and fixing long-ignored infrastructure issues. The new president, a retired school principal named Linda, was far more reasonable. She actually listened to homeowners instead of dictating what they could and couldn't do. The ridiculous fines and excessive HOA fees that had been creeping up under Karen's rule were reevaluated and, in some cases, reversed. One day, Linda stopped by while I was out watering my lawn. She gave me a polite smile and gestured toward my house. "You know," she said, "I always thought your home was unique." Karen made such a fuss about it, but I think it adds character to the neighborhood. I smirked. "Don't let Karen hear you say that. She might come back just to argue." Linda laughed. "Somehow I doubt that. She burned too many bridges. People were getting tired of her. They just didn't know how to stand up to her." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Karen had ruled through fear, manipulating people into following her lead. But once someone pushed back, her entire foundation crumbled. A few weeks later, the for sale sign in front of Karen's old house was replaced with a sold sign. The new owners, a young couple named Dave and Emily, moved in shortly after. They were friendly, easygoing, and completely oblivious to the war that had taken place before their arrival. One afternoon, while setting up their outdoor furniture, Dave walked over and introduced himself. "Hey, you're the architect, right?" he asked. I nodded. "That's me." Emily joined him, smiling. "We love your house. It's so different from everything else here." I chuckled. "Yeah, not everyone felt that way." Dave grinned. "Oh, we heard a little bit about the HOA drama. The realtor mentioned there was a difficult former president, but we didn't get all the details." I smirked. "Let's just say you moved in at the right time." Emily shook her head. "I don't get why people care so much. It's your house. If anything, it makes the neighborhood look more interesting. I like them already." Over time, I became something of an unofficial HOA consultant. Whenever someone had a dispute with the board, they'd come to me for advice. It wasn't that the new HOA was bad. It was just that old habits die hard, and some board members still had traces of Karen's authoritarian mindset. But now, the homeowners weren't afraid to push back. The HOA was no longer an unquestionable force. It was just a group of people managing community issues. One evening, as I was relaxing on my porch, I noticed an older gentleman from a few houses down walking toward me. His name was Tom, and he had been one of Karen's biggest supporters. I expected a lecture or a passive-aggressive comment, but instead, he stopped at the edge of my yard and let out a long sigh. "I owe you an apology," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For believing her," he admitted. "She made such a fuss about your house, made it sound like the world was ending. But now that she's gone, I realize how ridiculous it all was." I nodded, appreciating the honesty. She had a way of convincing people. Tom sighed again. "She made us think we had to fight you. But the truth is, you never did anything wrong. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for being part of that." I leaned back in my chair. "Apology accepted." He smiled, nodded, and walked away. That was when I knew I had truly won. Months passed, and life in the neighborhood settled into something almost normal. The HOA focused on real issues instead of personal vendettas. People stopped looking at me like an outsider. The hostility faded into something resembling mutual respect. One night, as I was flipping through TV channels, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Curious, I answered. "Hello." A familiar voice responded. "You're probably happy with yourself." I recognized it instantly. "Karen." I smirked. "Karen, I figured you'd be too busy ruining another neighborhood." There was a pause. Then, in a tone dripping with bitterness, she said, "Enjoy it while it lasts." And then she hung up. I stared at my phone, shaking my head. Even in defeat, she couldn't let it go. I set my phone down, walked outside, and stood on my driveway, looking at my house. The same house Karen had called ugly, the same house she had tried so hard to erase. It was still standing, still here. And so was I. Karen was gone, but my house? My house was forever.